Welcome everyone to the first series in my canon videos. We're going to begin with the 6 greatest English language poets. And in future videos I'm going to release 4 other canons. This is the first one. This is called the Cornerstone canon. And then after that there will be the Foundations canon of the 44 greatest poets. And after the Foundations canon I'll release the Golden canon, which has the 88 greatest poets, followed by the Silver canon, which has 188. And then I'll release the Master Canon of over 1,500 poets. And that final list will be a collection of any poet in the English, UK, predominantly American tradition who has made some contribution. There are some Canadian, some Australian, New Zealand poets, but I just was not able to find. It would be an enormous list, so I had to limit it to the UK and the US predominantly, but not exclusively. So anyone who's made any kind of poetic contribution, no matter how small, is aimed at being included in this canon, the larger one. But ars longa, vita brevis. There's a lot of art, and life is short, and this is why the concept of canons can be very helpful. You'll want to visit many poets, but you'll want to live among these 6. Alfred North Whitehead once said that moral education is impossible apart from the habitual vision of greatness. Maybe a little bit old-fashioned, but he's right. So let's talk about greatness. What determines the greatness of a poet? Is it just mere opinion? I think that there are 6 major kinds of greatness. There are 6 criteria. The first is his or her influence. What traditions and individual poets and literary movements has this poet inspired? And the second is literary merit. It's not just that this person has great ideas, it's that he or she expresses them beautifully and artfully. And this involves the art and science of critical evaluation. This is the job of the critic and the critical faculties of any reader. How well does the poet communicate what he or she wants to communicate? How easily are they able to use language to nourish our imaginations and speak to our hearts? The third criterion is literary achievement. What is the comprehensive effect and contribution of their whole body of work? Not just artistically, but morally, culturally, nationally perhaps, aesthetically, spiritually, and literarily. What has their entire body of work collectively accomplished in the world? And then the next criterion is that they justly represent human life. Is their art not only representative of their own particular times, but does it contain universal truths that will appeal and speak to all? Accurate representations of the human heart. And then the fifth is personal resonance, and this is how it resonates on an individual level. How has their work resonated among individuals and within yourself, the reader? And then finally, all of this contributes to the final criterion, which is the test of time. Has this work stood the test of time? Has it endured? And sometimes they'll endure for different reasons, and some poets who are great have not endured. But they usually resurface, just as Shakespeare did. He went through a time during the Augustan age in which not many critics really valued him, and that was partly because of Locke's scientific language and their suspicion against metaphor, but eventually Shakespeare came back towards the end of the 18th century. So the 6 poets I have chosen, I believe, fulfill these different ways, these criteria, in various ways. And I don't think that many of you will disagree with the first 3 that I've chosen, but the last 3 will likely inspire some debate. So I'll go in order of chronology, and the first is Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer's literary output includes some of the most important works in the English canon. His magnum opus is the Canterbury Tales, and this is the cornerstone of English literature. He would have actually considered Troilus and Cresside his great work, and in many respects it is. This collection of stories is told by a diverse group of pilgrims traveling to Canterbury, and it showcases Chaucer's mastery of various genres and his keen insight into human nature. It was written in the 14th century, and other significant works of his, aside from Troilus and Cresside, include the Parliament of Fowls, the Book of the Duchess, which is an elegy for Blanche of Lancaster, The House of Fame, and The Legend of Good Women. They're all noteworthy for their innovative narrative structures and their styles. In this medieval poet, Chaucer, there is the everlasting human. In his Troilus Crusade, you'll discover the high seriousness essential to any true tragedy. And in his Canterbury Tales, you'll find every rung of the medieval social ladder represented, from the church to the court, from the field to the shops. And the greatness of Chaucer lies somewhere in between flatulence and profundity. He's got this earthy humor. He's actually hilarious. One of the few poems to ever make me laugh aloud, and never fails to, is The Miller's Tale. He blends humor with seriousness. Chaucer's work is notable for its balance of this humor and serious themes. I mean, he's got quite a range, and the best poets always do. His writing reflects a kind of kind-hearted humor. Doesn't have much cruelty in it, and this is akin to the later works, I think, of Shakespeare. And this approach makes his stories engaging while also prompting readers to reflect on deeper moral and social issues. And The Wife of Bath tale is a good one for doing that. And so is the Franklin's Tale. One of my favorite stories in the Canterbury Tales is the Franklin's Tale. And I just want to read you a passage from his prologue. Sometimes the speakers, the pilgrims, when they go to tell their stories, they'll often preface it with something. Now, the Franklin, by the way, was a free man who owned land but was not of the nobility. So he wasn't a serf or a peasant, yet he wasn't a nobleman, so he was somewhere in between. And the Franklin gives a tale called A Breton Lay. A Breton Lay is an old, usually Celtic myth, or has to do with native England or Wales, usually in the Arthurian chivalric romance style. So this is the kind of tale that the Franklin tells. And if you go on the Harvard website, you'll find Chaucer's works. This is called Middle English, and then down below you have the modernization. Not a translation, but a modernization. So this is the Franklin speaking, addressing his companions. These are all the gentle Britons in her days, of diverse aventures mad and layers, remayed in her first Britain tongue, which layers with her instruments de songe, or elles read in him for her plaisance, and one of him have ye in remembrance, which ye shall say with good will as ye can. So he says, I'm going to tell a lay, which is an old song or story from the Bretons. And then this is his apology for not being as educated. But, Sirs, because I am a borough man, at my beginning first y'all beseche, have me excused of me rude speech. I learned never rhetoric certain, thing that I spake, it mote be bare and plan. I slept never on Mount of Parnaso, ne learned Marcus Tullius Scitaro, colours ne know I none, withouten dread, but switch colours as growing on the mead. Or elles switch as men die or paint, colours of rhetoric ben to me quent. Me spirit faileth not of switch mature, but if y'all least, me tal should ye hear. So you say, I'm not learned in Marcus Tullius or Cicero. The colors are the arts that I know, without a doubt, I don't have, except those that grow in the field. And so it's very, very beautiful this way. And then he goes into the lay, which is just a beautiful, kind of supernatural, chivalric lay. And so if you enjoy Britain lays, like the Franklin's Tale, you might read Marais de France or Chrétien de Troyes' chivalric romances. All of this has this beautiful Breton lay feel about it. But this is the beauty of Chaucer. Chaucer played a crucial role in shaping English language into, this robust medium for literary expression. He utilized the East Midlands dialect, which eventually became the standard for written English, and his use of iambic pentameter set the foundation for English poetic meter. John Dryden calls him the father of English poetry for good reason, because Chaucer blends the syllabic structure of French with the accentual rhythm of English. And what you get is this beautiful blend. What you get is iambic pentameter. And nowhere else do we get such an artful demonstration of medieval literary taste in action. If you want to know what people in the 14th century enjoyed hearing about, read the Canterbury Tales. We have the highbrow and the lowbrow in perfect harmony. Chaucer's ability to create vivid and diverse characters remains unparalleled, except for perhaps in Shakespeare, maybe even Dickens. But even those characters are very different, as I've mentioned before. With Dickens, you get some eccentric characters. With Shakespeare, you get more of a range of the Renaissance sensibility and the sort of characters that were inhabiting culture then. In Chaucer, you get people who you really think you know. They're very familiar, the way he describes them. So Chaucer's influence on subsequent poets is great. He was read by Shakespeare. His contemporaries lauded him. John Gower was a friend of his, and his reputation only grew as after his death. William Caxton, the first English printer, played a significant role in preserving his work and disseminating it. The 16th century, Chaucer was enjoyed by Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney and his circle with Mary Sidney, and all the way up into the 18th century, where you get, at the end of the 17th, John Dryden with his translations, Thomas Gray is studying Chaucer, William Wordsworth is studying Chaucer, some of the great Victorian poets, Tennyson, William Morris, they all studied Chaucer, and so his place in the canon is really indisputable. He's one of the great six. Now, the second poet is Edmund Spenser. Spenser's magnum opus, The Faerie Queene, stands as a cornerstone of English literature. The Faerie Queene is such a treat. There you'll find the font of all modern romance and fantasy. And by romance, I don't mean love stories written by Rosie M. Banks. I mean chivalric romance, the stories of adventure and of love. So if you love fantasy fiction, you're in for a treat with Spenser. He's beloved by George MacDonald, J.R.R. Tolkien in the 20th century, along with C.S. Lewis, and his magisterial allegory, The Faerie Queene, is your lifelong companion to lead you back to the worlds of medieval romance. Now, Edmund was a Renaissance man, but he sets it in the medieval period, and he also uses some medieval spelling and dialect in order to give you the feel that you're reading something that's older than it really is. So it's of knights in shining armor, of sorcerers, of witches, of monsters, men and women, warriors, defenders of purity and truth, and it's this extensive allegorical epic poem that explores various virtues through its complex structure and rich tapestry and symbolism. The poem was supposed to be 12 books, only 6 were completed, each representing a particular virtue as embodied by a knight in service to the Faerie Queene, Gloriana. Now, another significant work of his is The Shepherd's Calendar. This established, it's not much read today, this established, Spenser as a poet, and it engages in this very classical Puritan style that was popular in Cambridge during his day. You have the sonnets, the Amoretti sonnets, and the Epithalamion. Now, Spenser's legacy is really profound because it extends through the centuries of English poetry. His innovative use of language and form, particularly the Spenserian stanza which he invents, has had a huge lasting impact. Poets have been writing in the Spenserian stanzas for centuries ever since. James Beattie is perhaps one of the best ones to really do it. He's of the 18th century, a Scottish poet. Wordsworth tried it with his Salisbury Plain, along with other poets as well, but it's had this lasting impact, not just the stanza form, but the imagery itself. The stanza form is characterized by its rhyme scheme. You've got the A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. So you've got the 2 couplets there, one in the middle, one at the end. The last line is not iambic pentameter like the rest of the lines, but it's in iambic hexameter, which means it has an extra foot. It's called an Alexandrine with 6 metrical feet. And it's using this last line to kind of draw out to a conclusion what was described in the stanza. So when you open up the Faerie Queene, what you see are little bite-sized stanzas of the narration, and it makes it very accessible, I think, to new readers. You just take a stanza at a time, and each one tells you something that's happening in the action. Let me read you one of them. This is a great description of Una. seeing King Arthur coming over the plain for the first time. This is from Book 1, Canto 7. At last she chanced by good hap to meet a goodly knight, fair marching by the way, together with his squire, arrayed in meat. His glitter-and armour shined far away, like glancing light of Phoebus' brightest ray. From top to toe no place appeared bare, that deadly glint of steel endangered may. Athwart his breast a baldric brave he wear, that shined like twinkling stars with stones most precious rare. Spenser is such a poet of description, and it's no wonder that Keats learned so much from him. Spenser will use consonants beautifully, often loading the consonant play at the beginning of the word, as some scholars have noted. But Keats will take that further, because Keats was baptized as a poet in Spenser. He became a poet through Spenser, and he'll use the same things, he'll use the same tricks of Spenser, but he'll enrich them. For example, Keats, with his consonant interplay, will not just use the consonants at the beginning of the words, but also through the middle. And so what you get is this delicious interplay of language and sound. We'll talk a little bit about Spenser. He'll come up again throughout this talk. But the third poet, I think, will not surprise you. It's William Shakespeare. What to read of William Shakespeare if you haven't? Well, if you're a young person, you might start with the sonnets. There in the sonnets, you'll find all the highs and lows of friendship and romantic love. If you're an older person, you might enjoy his late plays. I think that Shakespeare's late romances are some of the most beautiful things we have. But Shakespeare's body of work includes not just drama, that is plays, but sonnets, as well as several narrative poems. So among his greatest works, if you want to start off with the drama, you should definitely read Hamlet. Harold Bloom's right when he says that there's so much of the modern psyche in Hamlet. It's a profound exploration of treachery, revenge, and moral corruption. Othello, another tragedy, a tragic tale of jealousy and manipulation. You have the sinister villain, Iago, who is one of the most brilliant and sinister villains Shakespeare could ever create. There's Macbeth, which is a gripping drama about ambition and power and guilt. And then another great tragedy, probably his greatest and longest, is King Lear. It's a poignant study on madness, on aging, and familial conflict. If you're looking for something a little more romantic, there's Romeo and Juliet, but it's just as tragic, as I'm sure you know. It's the quintessential romantic tragedy. If you want something fun, and I think this one always plays well with high schoolers and middle school students, it's the Midsummer Night's Dream, and that's not to disparage it. It's a play for all of life. But there's something about it with the banter and the bickering between the two couples that I think is really familiar to the post-adolescent experience. It's a masterful blend of comedy and fantasy, and there's a little bit of the Spenser in this play, because you've got the fairies and the green world of the forest, and it's there where all the conflict resolves in the end through magic. And then there's The Tempest, a really beautiful, complex narrative that interweaves themes of magic, betrayal, and redemption. I remember the first time I met my wife in person, we were walking down Brattle Street, and we were leaving somewhere, and I tossed off, "Our revels now are ended." And right away, she starts quoting the lines from The Tempest. It's that beautiful passage from Prospero. Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, solemn temples, yea, the great globe itself and all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. And so, immediately I was smitten with her. But the beauty of these lines is that, and many scholars think that this is Shakespeare's farewell to the stage. He mentions the globe and all which it inherit. Well, he's talking about the earth and the apocalyptic dissolution of all material things. And the use of metaphor here. The globe doesn't just refer to the globe of the earth. It's also the name of the theater in which Shakespeare put on most of his plays. There's biblical imagery from the Psalms. Psalm 46 is in there a little bit. There's the weight and glory of those metaphors and the selection of objects in that list. It's simply glorious. And all of his poetry is like that. Just pick it up anywhere. Pick a book of Shakespeare up and just start reading, and you'll be struck by the beauty of it. And like this universal, eternal relevance. But I've always been charmed by his imagery, and I think for me that the genius of Shakespeare will always be his metaphors and his figurative use of language. In no other poet do we have such wild yet harmonious and luscious growth of figurative speech. Each line is a chorus of singers who speak at different levels, at different aspects to the human heart, the body, the ear, the mind, the spirit. You have this sweet language to delight the ear. You've got the beautiful imagery to entertain the imagination, a certain magical symmetry of form that charms the fancy, and all of it is containing this truth that soothes the spirit amidst the pains of human experience. You just can't speak too hyperbolically about Shakespeare, although I know some critics almost do. Harold Bloom is one of them. He's got some really hyperbolic... Anyway, Shakespeare's the best poet in the English canon. We feel we know his characters. Shakespeare's ability to create complex, multi-dimensional characters is unparalleled. I mean, Shakespeare excelled in multiple genres. You have tragedy, comedy, history, romance, and he's superlative in each of these categories. The versatility of Shakespeare has made his works appealing to many people and adaptable to various interpretations and settings, and he's performed more often than any other playwright. His influence extends beyond literature into politics, philosophy, psychology, and pop culture. Shakespeare is the staple of every English literature curriculum. If you don't have Shakespeare, you're missing 50% of the canon. And once you read Shakespeare, you'll see how ubiquitous he is. The fourth greatest poet, going chronologically, is John Milton. All of the dignified heft and grandeur of a cathedral organ is in John Milton's Paradise Lost, particularly. I think that's his great work. It's one of the cornerstones of English literature. It's an epic poem written in blank verse. It delves into the themes of will, of temptation, of redemption, through the story of humanity's fall from grace. And the poem's complexity and the depth of its characters, particularly Satan, highlight Milton's mastery of language and theological insight. Just listen to this passage from Milton's Paradise Lost. This is from the council in hell when the demons and devils are all getting together and they're conspiring against humanity. Beelzebub gets up and he lays out a plan which Satan gave him for destroying humanity. By sudden onset, either with hell fire to waste his whole creation, or possess all as our own, and drive, as we were driven, the puny inhabitants, or if not drive, seduce them to our party, that their God may prove their foe, and with repenting hand abolish his own works. This would surpass common revenge, and interrupt his joy in our confusion, and our joy upraised in his disturbance, when his darling sons, hurled headlong to partake with us, shall curse their frail original, and faded bliss, faded so soon. Oh, it's so sinister, Beelzebub. He next to Satan is pretty much the next arch fiend, but they're all conspiring how to get back at God, and he decides there to do it, and he convinces the council to go after the newly created humans on Earth. Such a hair-raising scene, and if you just listen to his words, you'll find the grandeur of the rhetoric just coming through, especially when you read it aloud slowly. Milton has other notable works. Paradise Regained, Samson Agonistes. Now, Samson Agonistes further explores themes of faith and resilience and divine providence, much like Paradise Lost. And I think Once you've read Paradise Lost, and I do have lectures on every book of Paradise Lost on my YouTube and on my website. If you finish that and you want to continue, I'd go on to Samson Agonistes, not necessarily Paradise Regained, unless you have a really good theological background. Paradise Regained is often considered anticlimactic, people coming from Paradise Lost to regain, because it's all about Christ's temptation in the wilderness, and it doesn't have much of the epic energy as Paradise Lost, but it's still an exceptionally excellent poem. Additionally, he has early poems. He's a great lyricist. You have Lycidas, L'Allegro, and Il Penseroso, which showcase John Milton's lyrical prowess and his ability to blend classical and Christian and pastoral elements. Milton's contributions to literature are multifaceted. You first have his use of blank verse, which during the Augustan age, when he was writing this poem, was radical and unexpected. You wanted to write in heroic couplets, you wanted to write in something in rhyme, but Milton refused to do that. And he really revolutionized English poetry by providing this flexible yet dignified form that influenced countless poets, mostly the Romantic poets and the Victorian poets. His ability to create these nuanced characters, explore the same themes like Shakespeare. He's got this gift of justice, of free will, of psychological development and complexity. Even Satan is so complex. Adam is also complex, and I think Eve is perhaps the most complex human in the poem, but you'll find eternal humanity in them. Now, as I said, many may not agree with Milton. Some of you might be, well, of course, John Milton, he's a big poet. I would expect him here. But some wouldn't. I put him among the top 6, but T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and the Leavesites, well, they wouldn't, and they're wrong. Milton's works have improved a wide range of writers and language, and poetic language. His style, his themes, his innovations in verse have permeated English literature, made him a central figure. And I think that what we get with Milton is a great extension of the Spenserian meditative and romantic mode. So with Spenser, you have this river coming from the font of Spenser, which courses through Milton, and then goes underground for a while, and then rises up somewhere around the mid-18th century with Thomas Gray, and then just becomes this torrent in the Romantic period and in the Victorian period. And it's that tradition that we're tracing here. So Milton is certainly a staple in the study of English literature. No library is complete without a copy of Milton. Now, the fourth poet is William Wordsworth. And the thing about William Wordsworth's poetry is that he created the taste by which his poems are to be enjoyed and judged. And that may seem like cheating, but it's not. He told his original readers in the late 18th century not to judge him on a first reading. His work was surprising and strange to late 18th century readers. You must suspend your judgment, he said, until you have perused his poems again and again, and then you must come to your judgment. But whether or not you have read Wordsworth before, your aesthetic judgment is probably shaped by the Romantic movement, especially if you're in the West, and especially if you're American. In a way, he created the taste by which we appreciate much poetry today. If you ask somebody, what do you think of when you think of poetry? They'll probably say, well, I think of nature, I think of trees, maybe flowers. That's really because of the Romantics. And if you were to go back to the early 19th century and ask what people thought of poetry, they'd say, oh, well, public rhetoric, upstanding morals, high subject matter, reverent diction, a neoclassical style, very learned. It's very different now because of Wordsworth and his contemporaries. A rhapsody on flowers may appear to us as commonplace or even quaint, what we might expect in a poem, and insignificant. But in his poetry, you'll find a way of looking at the world, and this is what Wordsworth gives us. This is the genius of Wordsworth. People will say, Wordsworth, really, the top 6 greatest English poets. In the top 6, besides Shakespeare and Spenser. Absolutely. And I can defend that more in the comment section. But Wordsworth's most celebrated work, I think, is Lyrical Ballads. It's the most taught, at least, in classrooms, and he co-authored that with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another Romantic. But this collection marked the beginning of a reformation of poetic diction. of the words that poets use. This book included some famous poems such as Tintern Abbey. Another seminal work is the Prelude, a very long autobiographical epic poem written in the style of Paradise Lost, the blank verse, and it details the development of his poetic consciousness, his spiritual journey, and his relationship to nature and to God through nature. Wordsworth's long poem, The Excursion, is like that as well, published in 1814. It's another major work that showcases, I think it really showcases Wordsworth's philosophical nature, his reflections on humanity and society. Additionally, his shorter poems, like the Lucy poems, or his ode on intimations of immortality, are crucial for understanding his lyric prowess and his spiritual depth. I think it's the spiritual depth that really Wordsworth brings gifts to us. I think Wordsworth is the poet of our age today. If there's any poet we need to be reading in the early 21st century, it's William Wordsworth. And you might start with Tintern Abbey. This has shaped me. This poem has grown with me as I have grown, and I feel in a way I can claim its form as my own history. That's a strange thing to say, but sometimes you develop these connections with poems, and maybe for you it's Wordsworth, maybe for you it's someone else. But there are lines in Tintern Abbey that have always come back to me, and they kind of startled me. They come out of the deep memory and speak back. Some of the poems will do this. I've carried it into all kinds of places. I remember standing on I was hiking on a mountain, and you get to the top, and you can see all above, and I thought of those lines, and I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. So, lines like that, they describe experiences in nature that you're not going to hear on the radio, you're not going to hear on Spotify, you really won't see it on TikTok, but it speaks to something that's true in the human reality, and something that we're apt to forget amidst the distraction of modern contemporary life. And so I think this is a real gift that we should not be neglecting in Wordsworth. Another thing that I think Wordsworth gives us is he reminds us of what the memory is. The memory is a house that you curate. People talk about buying houses and you do the maximalist style or the dark academia style, the light academia aesthetic. Think of your mind this way. And what poems do you hang upon its walls? What art do you return back? The memory is a storehouse for food, and he talks about this in Tintern Abbey. I remember just before I was married, on my wedding day, these lines came to me from Tintern Abbey. It totally has nothing to do with marriage, but just these spots of time, as Wordsworth calls them. And here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts, that in this moment there is life and food for future years. The idea that your memory will feed you. What you place in your memory, when you're all alone in your mind, without your smartphone, without screens, and all you have is your own heart, what are you left with? What memories have you kept? That's what Wordsworth gives us. His contributions to literature include this spiritual awareness that I think is very pertinent for our time. Literarily, his revolutionary approach to poetry and his deep philosophical insights were paired with this simple language, the language of graceful simplicity. Wordsworth is renowned for his depiction of nature as living, a spiritual presence, and his poetry reflects this deep love and reverence for the natural world. And he does it all through this everyday language. Wordsworth advocated for the use of everyday language in poetry and believed that poetry should be accessible to all people and should reflect the true emotions and experiences of ordinary life. So this principle was articulated in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. So you might look that up if you're interested in that. Now, our last poet in the list of the 6 greatest poets is T.S. Eliot. And if you're able to read one poet of the modernist period, it would have to be Eliot. It should be, without a doubt, Eliot. No other poet influenced so many other poets of his era. William Perkins, by the way, this book is what I recommended in the Harvard 1983 list. This was on the list. It's got great introductions to the poets. This is what Perkins says about Eliot. By the end of the 1920s, his poetry was an inescapable influence on younger poets, and his criticism shaped their work even more pervasively, if only because they read the authors he praised. 20 years later, Eliot's The Waste Land was still widely regarded as the most radical and brilliant development of modernist poetry. Thus, the future development of poetry did not proceed from Eliot, but both from and against him, and in both respects, he was central. So, any poet writing in the modernist period had to wrestle with Eliot. They had to either write with him, or adopt his style, or they had to write against him, and to violently write contra Eliot. But there was no way to escape him, and that's partly why I'm adding Eliot here, even though it's not even 100 years past since Eliot was writing his greatest works. So this is tricky because we don't have the test of time, but we do have poets and critics attesting to the profound influence and greatness of Eliot. The poet William Empson, who's also a critic, probably knew him better as a critic, William Empson said, "I do not know for certain how much of my mind Eliot invented." That's a huge statement. So pervasive was his presence that the poet Archibald MacLeish wrote to a friend, Peel Bishop, and said that after Eliot, the only thing a poet could write was more Eliot. And this goes into the burden of the past, or the anxiety of influence for all of these poets in the 20th century. But this made things difficult for other poets in Eliot's era. Hart Crane, an excellent poet in his own right, overcame this dilemma, he says, by discovering a way through Eliot towards a different goal. Another poet, Stanley Kunitz, said that the decades leading up to World War II, a reader could hardly pick up a poem by a young writer without overhearing Eliot somewhere in the background. In the 20s and 30s, one had to follow Eliot in order to win a reputation or an audience. So T.S. Eliot is considered one of the top poets in the English language for his groundbreaking works, significant contributions to literary modernism, and enduring influence on poetry and criticism. In Eliot, you'll find the poetry appropriate for contemporary and modern life. You won't get so much a sense of that in Chaucer. You might get a sense of it in the consciousness of Hamlet and Shakespeare. The sort of harmony and romantic chivalric unity that holds together the moral worlds and landscapes of Edmund Spenser won't really resonate, I think, with contemporary readers. We can fantasize about it and enjoy it that way. But if you want a poet that's going to resonate with you as a person living in the 21st century, even if you're an old soul, Eliot is the poet. Eliot's most celebrated work is The Waste Land, which is often hailed as the masterpiece of modernist poetry. The poem's fragmented structure, its heteroglossia, its many-voiced textures, the rich allusions, the exploration of post-war disillusionment have made it seminal to the 20th century. Another major work is the Four Quartets, a series of 4 long poems that delve into the themes of time, of spiritual experience and depression, of these states of consciousness that are accessible to humans, and themes of redemption and the human condition. His first poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is also a key work, marking his early success and showcasing his unique style and his thematic concerns. Eliot revolutionized modernist poetry and poetry ever since, and his innovative use of imagery, symbolism, structure, all influenced the modernist movement and the postmodernist movement, all the way up to the contemporary poets today. And his work broke the traditional form, the poetic expectations. He frustrated them. He incorporated elements from various cultures and literary traditions to reflect the complexity of modern life and the global experience. And I think Eliot has described states of consciousness that no other English poet was able to describe. I think he does that in the Four Quartets. And we're going through the reading group of the 4 quartets now as I'm filming this. And it's just amazing what different readers are picking up of things that escaped me and other readers, things that I didn't even know to look for. And so we have such a diverse readership in our reading group that it's really great to see this poem and to hear about it from these different perspectives. It's really a multifaceted gem, and discussion just kind of turns it in the light like that. So that's been an amazing experience, but it just goes to show how great a poem the 4 Quartets is. It's really a series of poems. Now I want to read you a passage from East Coker, which is the 2nd quartet. I have a video, an introductory video on this poem, if you're interested in it. Might be a good place to start. So he's describing this state with this simile. As in a theater, the lights are extinguished, for the scene to be changed with a hollow rumble of wings, with a movement of darkness on darkness, and we know that the hills and the trees, the distant panorama, and the bold imposing facade are all being rolled away. And of course, we hear Shakespeare's The Tempest, that Prospero's farewell speech that I quoted earlier, and then he modulates, goes into a different simile, or as when an underground train in the tube stops too long between stations, and the conversation rises and slowly fades into the silence, and you see behind every face the mental emptiness deepen, leaving only the growing terror of nothing to think about, or when, under ether, the mind is conscious, but conscious of nothing. I said to my soul, be still, and wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. Wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. So the darkness shall be light, and the stillness the dancing. It's a poem that may seem depressing. It deals with, just from that excerpt, it deals with themes of spiritual dryness, of depression, of states of suspension, of waiting. But it's also a poem filled with hope, I think. It doesn't leave us there. It takes us there because we all must go there eventually. And it offers a way through. It provides a map through the dark night of the soul, I think. And it assures us that we are not alone in our experience, those of us who have experienced it, and that such experiences are possible and are natural and should be endured to a greater end. And I think Eliot's legacy is multifaceted, like his themes and modern disillusionment, methods of fragmentation, his quests for meaning and for understanding and for reconciliation, all make him the great poet I think that he is. But I'd say that if you want a good introduction into English literature, you have to live among these poets. Now I'll say, this is not a map of literary history because there are huge gaps. You'll notice there's no one from the 18th century. No Dryden or Alexander Pope or Jonathan Swift. But they are great poets. You know, in the 18th century, after Milton, two traditions diverged. One was the meditative Miltonic mode, which was a stream which went underground for a while, and the other was this predominant neoclassical Augustan mode of Pope, of the neoclassical style of correctness. And these are great poets, and admirable poets, and in many respects should not be forgotten. And so I think the greatest of them is Alexander Pope. You want to hear the most beautiful heroic verse ever written in English? It has to be Alexander Pope. But he's not included, because after a while, this predominant mode of neoclassicism was eclipsed by a critical preference for Romanticism during the development of English literature curricula and departments. And even though Pope still has a huge presence in the departments. I think the 18th century gets the short end of the stick sometimes. So I wanted to add Alexander Pope, and so as an appendix, I would add him as a number 7, because the Augustan tradition is a very important one. Now in my next video, I'll give you a more comprehensive list with the 44 greatest poets. Thanks everyone for watching the Cornerstone Canon. You can find a list of these canons on my website in the description below, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks again.